I'm going to tell you what nearly everybody gets wrong about the environment, how I found out, and how learning clarifies everything about it. I grew up acting fairly environmental, at least as far as I knew. I turned off the lights, I took the subway. The more I learned about factory farming, the less I could stomach meat. Now, I thought you needed it to live, but somehow at 19 years old, in 1990, I decided to try cutting it out. No long-term plan. I actually didn't think I would make it, and I didn't get support from anyone, but somehow it stuck, and I kept with it. A couple years later, after I adjusted, I did the same thing happened with hydrogenated oil. Then after I adjusted a few years later, the same thing happened with corn syrup, and I cut that out. And some years later, overly processed food. Each time, I really didn't think I would make it. I thought my diet would suffer, have less variety, but constraints bred creativity. I learned new ways to shop and cook, and it stuck each time, and I'd like to change. About 5 years ago, I noticed how much garbage I produced, and how much of it came from food packaging. Now, garbage is different than food because my garbage pollutes your world. So I felt ashamed, and I couldn't think of what to do about it, so I felt helpless. I wondered, could I go without packaged food? Not to change everything. I don't not steal to stop other people from stealing. I don't steal because I think it's wrong, and I think me polluting is wrong too. So I challenged myself to go for 1 week buying no packaged food. Again, I didn't think I would make it. Actually, I made it 2.5 weeks. Enough time to see my diet become more delicious, cheaper, and more convenient. So I kept going. At the beginning, I would empty my garbage about once a week. Then I got to about once a month, and I kept going. So the last time I emptied my garbage was September 2018. And the time before that was June 2017. Here's me with a year of garbage. Oh, cool. I have to say, it is incredibly liberating to have something like 90% less garbage in your life, in your house, in your body. In 2015, I learned that flying New York-LA round trip warmed the globe about a year's worth of driving. In Manhattan without a car, I thought I was polluting a lot less, but this meant that I was polluting over the Paris Agreement recommendations to keep global warming below 1.5 degrees. How could I criticize someone for pulling out of the Paris Agreement when I had done so myself? Now, I grew up flying. My parents met in India. I spent a year of my childhood there. And between school, work, and conferences, 6 continents, about 24 countries, flying for me meant discovery and growth and family and things like that. Not that it really mattered, because as far as I could tell, I didn't really feel I had any options. But that level of pollution made me feel again that helplessness and that shame. Those earlier experiments worked out. So I got into my head, could I go for a year without flying? Now tell me if this inner monologue sounds familiar. A year without flying, that sounds kind of hard. How do I get out of this? I know, family. I got to see mom and dad. And work, I got to eat. What can I do? My hands are tied. I have to fly. My mind came up with every other excuse too. The plane was going to fly anyway. Governments, corporations, they should change. What I do doesn't matter. The plane should be solar. Sound familiar? The early experiments worked, so I decided to go with it. A week in, my sister invited me to join her family. She found round-trip tickets to Tokyo for $800. I thought, I'm never going to see tickets that cheap again. I'll start after I get back. But then, am I trying to live by my values or not? So I didn't go, and I stuck with it. I'd been negotiating to speak at a conference in Italy. I emailed, will you pay for me to go by boat? They never wrote back. My friends' travel stories, they filled me with envy. I felt like a chump, everybody benefiting from my sacrifice but me. But constraints bred creativity, and I learned to find ways to get the value of travel without the flying. Why did I fly? Here are some reasons and how I got more of each. I flew for culture. Frances Hesselbein, my friend and mentor, lived through World War I, the Depression, Prohibition, World War II. She is from as different a culture as Timbuktu. So I spent more time with her by subway, and I learned of her worlds, which led me to find that cultural diversity in people around me everywhere, shopkeepers, neighbors, everyone. I flew for family. It happened that year my uncle died in Pittsburgh. So yes, a death in the family. This was for real, not a game. Everybody wanted me to fly there. Instead, I worked out carpooling there with my sister, leading to more family time with less emissions. I traveled for work. All right, Italy didn't happen, but a Salt Lake City conference happily paid for me to take the train there. Not flying led to me invited to speak here, an earlier TEDx talk. I'm doing a keynote on it next month and plenty of other opportunities. I flew for adventure. I took a train to a conference in California. Now, that's 18 hours worth of stories, but a couple highlights. I wrote my book, From Sea to Shining Sea. I arranged to speak at universities and corporations and friends in Chicago, LA, Ventura, San Diego, Houston, New Orleans, Atlanta. I lived, it's the journey, not the destination. I flew to meet different people. Actually living by the values that many people talk about, but not everybody lives by, I believed helped establish me as an authentic, genuine leader. Bringing to my podcast and to my life people like, oh, I forgot to mention I traveled for food. Forced to buy food from farmers near me, I found things that I'd never tasted before. Things like tomatillos, burdock, husk cherries, kabocha squash, lavender. I foraged Juneberries and herbs as delicious as anything in the tropics in Manhattan. As I mentioned, I traveled to meet people as well. So some of the people that I met on my podcast and in my life were a Nobel Peace Prize winner, the person with the most viewed TED Talk of all time, McKinsey's 3-time global managing director, an Olympic gold medalist, a Super Bowl champion, a 4-star general, a CMO from a Fortune 5 company, a Pulitzer winner, and more. And I met them as peers and friends. Several came over for my famous no-packaging vegetable stew. Some I cleaned beaches with. I traveled for vacation. Wondering if I'd ever get off North America again, I took sailing lessons, much cheaper and much more accessible than flying. And on the water is timeless and beautiful. When planning a trip sailing from Florida to Mexico, most people would ask me when and where the trip would begin and end. Sailors asked about the currents, the tides, and the weather that time of year, and I prefer that world. I traveled to experience nature. A friend's ecotourism business flies people up the Amazon in search of untouched nature. They're touching it. Their emissions there and back pollute and destroy what they think that they're protecting. Meanwhile, my staying home led me to create my window garden. Now, it's no rainforest, but I get to touch and nurture and develop nature, not destroy it. I could go on about comfort and convenience and getting places faster. Different people get different things from travel. I was able to create what I wanted that I thought only came from travel. Anyone who tries, if you try, you'll be able to create what you miss. And the challenge is not flying. Anyone cannot fly. We're not flying right now. The challenge is to create what I used to think only came from flying. And that meant learning and expanding myself. I knew when I started, day 366, I would be on a flight, no question. By month 3, I was thinking about a second year. Now I'm 4 years in. I may fly again, I don't know, but I want to less and less. Yes, some things only come from flying, but the meaning, purpose, and value, they aren't out there. They're in here. I've talked to hundreds of people about not flying. Overwhelmingly, they support it, although for others, even my mom says, Josh, stop talking about not flying. You'll lose everyone. At most, talk about less meat. My dad has not foregone one flight. And I learned, a flight brings me to someone distant. Flying in general makes it so my communities are distant in the first place. Flying doesn't give me more time with other people. It just spreads me thin. That's why my parents can't be here. My mom is in France, my dad's in India. I learned that in a world this big and this beautiful, I can't see everything and everyone. And my best strategy is to enjoy here, now, us, wherever I am. A lot's happened since I wrote this talk at first. The Amazon has suffered record burning. We grieve the rainforest loss, yet our flying heats the globe more, despite our having more options. We can replant trees, but we can't put jet fuel back underground. Hurricane Dorian caused yet more record losses. The Prime Minister of Barbados said, "We are in the forefront of the consequences of climate change, but we don't cause it." Actually, I looked it up. Barbados emits double the world average per capita. And that's not counting all the flying in and out, which they promote. She could have said, because we emit so much, we will lead in reducing. She could have led. We continue to lack role models. All the US presidential candidates continue to fly at whim, as did Al Gore and Leonardo DiCaprio. And this is what everybody gets wrong about the environment. Everybody believes that it's deprivation and sacrifice, that they're missing something, that they're losing out. And when leaders believe that, they make the choice between there's something that might happen bad in the future, but we might avoid it. And so you have to do something you don't want to do now. But I want to make that choice. What I found, which was joy in this, that you have to experience it. I want to make the choice. What I experienced, it's joy right now. And so I acted to share what I discovered. I started that podcast, and I bring on my podcast world-renowned leaders to share their environmental values, act on them, and then to share the results, almost always joyful. And the reason I picked the people before that you saw, these world-renowned people, is that this is not just about individual change, as important as that is. It's about group change and systemic change. So people listening can say, that's someone that I know, that's someone that I respect, that's someone in my community. I want to change too. It's time that I acted. I ask a lot of people, what would happen if you chose to go for a year without flying? Most people won't answer. Some refuse even to imagine what would happen. Those that answer say things like, well, I can't because of work and family, but that's not what I asked. So I ask you to think about it. What would happen if you went for a year without flying? You would learn to live sustainably, or a lot closer to it. You wouldn't die, you wouldn't suffer. You would learn to live sustainably. And you'd have a lot easier time than the possible billion climate refugees who would have to face losing their homes, possible war, and things like that. The first few months would be hard. Then joy and discovery and community. Because in today's world, perhaps the best thing we can do for each other as people is to consume less, to fly less, to have fewer children. Because what we do affects each other, and that's community. And communities change when people lead them. Before I acted, I associated environmental leadership with deprivation and sacrifice. But it's not. It's about joy and community. People think when I talk about DiCaprio and Gore telling people not to fly when they themselves are flying, they think that I'm calling them a hypocrite, but I'm not. They're missing out. Like someone who eats so much ice cream that they forget how delicious an apple can taste. So a lot of people ask me, Josh, okay, I want to do something. What specifically do I do? And so I ask back, what specifically do you care about? Clean air, clean water, the park at the end of the block that has now become a shopping mall? Pick a care that resonates with you and act. The joy will come. We will all do all of these things eventually, so it doesn't matter where you start, but start. Your mind, when you begin, will say, oh, you can't do it, it doesn't matter, but you can do it, and what you do will matter. It'll be difficult, and you'll make it through. And soon enough, you'll find that 6 months have passed, and you haven't even filled one load of garbage, or whatever it is that you do. And because you start with a passion, with something that you care about, you'll learn more, and you'll do more, and you'll share more. And people ask, how'd you know all this stuff? It's because you acted. And soon enough, stewardship will feel as natural as not smoking. It's already happening. Pick a joy. Pick something that resonates with you. Find it, act on it, and get that joy. Thank you.